If there's one resource that followers of the hedonic theory may crave above all others, it's money.
Cash. All the money I can get, all the money in the world.
To win the lottery. On $1 billion.
And the reason is that money can buy every pleasure there is. Therefore, according to the hedonic theory, money can buy happiness. If happiness is just the sum of hedonic moments, as Aristippus said, and money can buy those hedonic moments, then money can buy happiness itself. That's the idea. Many of us instinctively believe that if we could only be rich, we would be happy. To discover whether the theory holds true, researchers have for years been exploring the connection between wealth and happiness. And what they've discovered has always left them a bit puzzled. It turns out that money doesn't buy happiness at all. We need a little bit of money to supply our basic needs, to put a roof over our heads and clothes on our back and food on our plates. But beyond that, money ceases to have much influence on our happiness levels. Professor Michael Norton from Harvard Business School has been conducting research on this issue for years, and he says the studies are designed to, quote, address a paradox that economists have talked about for a long time, that increases in income don't tend to lead to big increases in happiness. People buy bigger and bigger houses, but they don't seem to get much happier as a result. Norton and his team have explored this issue in many ways, and we're going to look at some of their experiments here in this episode. So in the first experiment, he gathered 632 participants. Each person was asked how much money they made annually. They were then asked how much of their income they spent on themselves and how much money they gave to other people and charities. The participants were then asked to rate their levels of happiness. The findings showed that those who spent the most money on others tended to be far happier. How much money they spent on themselves seemed to have no impact on their happiness levels at all. None, zero, zilch. Norton concluded that there was a strong correlation between how much we give and how happy we are. In this next clip, he explains how he then took the concept a step further and applied it to the entire world using Gallup research polls.
We also wanted to go even broader and look at every country in the world, if we could, to see what the relationship is between money and happiness. So I'll show you a world map in a second, but we got data from the Gallup organization, which you know from all the political polls that have been happening lately. They asked people, did you donate money to charity recently? And they asked them, how happy are you with your life in general? And we can see what the relationship is between those two things. Are they positively correlated? Giving money makes you happy, or are they negatively correlated? On this map, green will mean they're positively correlated, and red means they're negatively correlated. And you can see the world is crazily green. So in almost every country in the world where we have this data, people who give money to charity are happier people than people who don't give money to charity. I know you're all looking at that red country in the middle. I would be a jerk and not tell you what it is, but in fact, it's Central African Republic. You can make up stories. Maybe it's different there for some reason or another. Just below that to the right is Rwanda, though, which is amazingly green. So almost everywhere we look, we see that giving money away makes you happier than keeping it for yourself.
Many more experiments confirmed these findings. In experiment number 2, they gave 16 employees of a Boston-based company a bonus, averaging around $5,000. Before receiving it, each employee was asked to rate their levels of happiness. Later on, they were asked how they had spent the bonus money and then asked again to rate how happy they were. Those who had spent most of the bonus money on others reported far higher levels of happiness compared to those who had spent it on themselves. In addition, the size of the bonus appeared to have no impact on their happiness. Norton said, the dollar amount of the bonus had no impact on happiness over time. People were just as happy whether they received $3,000 or $8,000. All that mattered, the only thing that affected their happiness levels, was the percent spent on other people. In experiment number 3, the team went to the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and handed out envelopes of money to students containing either $5 or $20. Some of the students were asked to spend the money on themselves and some were asked to spend the money on other people. And again, here's Michael Norton explaining how that experiment turned out.
On one Vancouver morning, we went out on the campus at University of British Columbia, and we approached people and said, do you want to be in an experiment? If they said yes, we asked them how happy they were, and then we gave them an envelope. And one of the envelopes had things in it that said, by 5 p.m. today, spend this money on yourself. So we gave some examples of what you could spend it on. Other people in the morning got a slip of paper that said, by 5 p.m. today, spend this money on somebody else. Also inside the envelope was money, and we manipulated how much money we gave them. So some people got this slip of paper and $5. Some people got this slip of paper and $20. We let them go about their day. They did whatever they wanted to do. We found out that they did, in fact, spend it in the way that we asked them to. We called them up at night and asked them, what'd you spend it on, and how happy do you feel now? What did they spend it on? Well, these are college undergrads, so a lot of what they spent it on for themselves was things like earrings and makeup. Apparently some of them were women. Earrings and makeup. What about for other people? Very different things. One woman said she bought a stuffed animal for her niece. People gave money to homeless people. Huge effect here of Starbucks. So if you give undergraduates $5, it looks like coffee to them, and they run over to Starbucks and spend it as fast as they can. But some people bought a coffee for themselves the way they usually would, but other people said that they bought a coffee for somebody else. So the very same purchase, just targeted toward yourself or targeted toward somebody else. What did we find when we called them back at the end of the day? People who spent money on other people got happier. People who spent money on themselves, nothing happened. It didn't make them less happy, it just didn't do much for them. And the other thing we saw is that the amount of money doesn't matter that much. So people thought that $20 would be way better than $5. In fact, it doesn't matter how much money you spent. What really matters is that you spent it on somebody else rather than on yourself. We see this again and again when we give people money to spend on other people instead of on themselves.
So each experiment is giving the same result. If you spend money on yourself, you won't feel much different in the long run. But if you spend money on others, you get this huge boost of happiness. There's a direct correlation in life between how much you give, how generous you are, and how happy you are. Other studies show that the principle doesn't just apply to giving money. You can give your time too. Sonia Lubomirsky of the University of California conducted a study where one group of participants was asked to carry out 5 acts of kindness each week for 6 weeks, and another group were asked to live their normal lives and make no changes. At the end of the 6-week trial, both groups were measured for happiness levels, and it was discovered the group who were doing the acts of kindness were feeling much, much happier. The group that hadn't been doing the acts of kindness felt no difference. And the conclusion was that if you were generous to others with your time, you're going to feel happier. One final experiment worth looking at comes from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, just to press home the amount of data there is on this subject. In 2017, a team picked 48 people to participate in a study. Each person was given a sum of money each week for 4 weeks. They were then split into 2 groups. One group was told to use the money for acts of generosity, to give the money away to others, and the other group had to spend the money on themselves. All participants were asked to report on their happiness levels before and after the experiment, and you guessed it, those who had given the money away reported feeling much happier at the end of the month. Professor Tobler led the study, and he echoed Michael Norton when he said the size of the act didn't really matter. All that mattered was that the money was spent on other people. He said, "You don't need to become a martyr to feel happier, just being a little more generous will suffice." Now, this is all extremely counterintuitive. Our intuition is locked into the hedonic theory. We are sure that to be happy, we must buy things for ourselves. We should buy pleasure for ourselves, whether that be cars, entertainment, alcohol, bigger houses. We are sure that this is the path to happiness. This is so instinctive. And yet the science has come along and said, no. That is a false idea. That instinct that we have doesn't play out in reality. If we want to be truly happy, we need to give our money away, give our time away, give our energy away. In other words, we need to stop following the hedonic path and follow the righteous path instead. Now, does giving time, energy, and our money away to others require discipline, sacrifice, and discomfort? Yes, it does. But the science tells us this is the path to happiness. In fact, the Zurich team said something very insightful during their study on this. They said, generosity is not necessarily an intuitive choice, as any selfless act comes at a personal cost. When we do something for someone else, we typically give away some of our personal resources, such as time, energy, or money. And that's why we are so much less inclined to take this path, because it does require something of us, and it does require discipline and sacrifice and discomfort. Yet, this is the one that leads to joy. During Michael Norton's experiments, he too asked the participants to predict beforehand whether spending money on themselves or on others would produce more happiness. And all those participants in Norton's studies predicted that spending money on themselves would produce the more joy. It's just so ingrained within us. And yet his experiments proved them wrong, as did all the others. In fact, I'm going to play one more clip from Michael Norton. Listen very carefully to the message in this clip.
It's not so much that money can't buy happiness. It's not so much that money can't buy happiness, it's that if you think that, you're actually just not spending it right. So that instead of spending it the way you usually spend it, maybe if you spent it differently, that might work a little bit better. And before I tell you the ways that you can spend it that will make you happier, let's think about the ways we usually spend it that don't, in fact, make us happier. We had a little natural experiment. So CNN a little while ago wrote this interesting article on what happens to people when they win the lottery. Turns out people think when they win the lottery their lives are going to be amazing. This article is about how their lives get ruined. So what happens when people win the lottery is, number one, they spend all the money and go into debt. And number two, all of their friends and everyone they've ever met find them and bug them for money. And it ruins their social relationships, in fact. So they have more debt and worse friendships than they had before they won the lottery. What was interesting about the article was people started commenting on the article, readers of the thing. And instead of talking about how it had made them realize that money doesn't lead to happiness, everyone instantly started saying, you know what I would do if I won the lottery? And fantasizing about what they do. And here's just two of the ones that we saw that are just really interesting to think about. One person wrote in, when I win, I'm going to buy my own little mountain and have a little house on top. And another person wrote, I would fill a big bathtub with money and get in the tub while smoking a big fat cigar and sipping a glass of champagne. This is even worse now. Then I'd have a picture taken and dozens of glossies made. Anyone begging for money or trying to extort from me would receive a copy of the picture and nothing else. And so many of the comments were exactly of this type, where people got money, and in fact, it made them antisocial. So I told you that it ruins people's lives and that their friends bug them. It also, money often makes us feel very selfish, and we do things only for ourselves. And we said, well, maybe the reason that money doesn't make us happy is that we're always spending it on the wrong things, and in particular, that we're always spending it on ourselves. And we thought, I wonder what would happen if we made people spend more of their money on other people. So instead of being antisocial with your money, what if you were a little bit more pro-social with your money? And we thought, let's make people do it and see what happens. So let's have some people do what they usually do and spend money on themselves, and let's make some people give money away and measure their happiness and see if in fact they get happier.
Now, of course, we already know that his experiments did prove that giving money away makes us happier, but notice what else he said there in that clip. He said that even when you show people this data, even when you show categorically that money doesn't buy happiness, even when you show that the hedonic theory is empty and you lay it all down in clear black and white, it still doesn't compute in our minds. We're still wedded to the hedonic theory. All we can think when we hear such stories is, oh, but I would be happy if I had the money. If I had that much money, this is how I'd spend it. I'd get a house, I'd get a Ferrari. It's just so difficult to break away from this instinct in us. But the only way that money can make us happy is if we learn to give it away, if we learn to be generous with it. Being generous doesn't just make us happier, it makes us physically healthier too. In 1999, a study at Berkeley, California, led by Doug Oman, discovered that elderly people who volunteered for 2 or more organizations were 44% less likely to die over a 5-year period compared to non-volunteers. Even after controlling for their age, exercise habits, general health, and negative habits like smoking, the results were the same. Generosity reduced death rates by 44%. A 2003 study at the University of Michigan, led by Stephanie Brown, produced the same results. She and her team studied elderly couples and discovered that those who provided practical help to friends, relatives, and neighbors had a much lower risk of dying over a 5-year period than those who didn't. Interestingly, receiving help had no link to a reduced death risk in that study. Only giving made the difference. A 2006 study between Johns Hopkins University and the University of Tennessee further indicated that those who give of their time and money to others have lower blood pressure and less stress than those who don't. And this reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and strokes. And of course, people who are healthier in their bodies tend to be happier in their mind. It's all connected. There's one final benefit of generosity that I want to highlight in this video, and it's called a virtuous cycle. Scientists have discovered that if you are generous to someone, you build a sense of connection to that person. You become personally invested in that person and what they're doing, and they in return feel a sense of gratitude and goodwill towards you. Both sides also get a boost of a feel-good chemical called oxytocin, which gives us a feeling of warmth and euphoria and trust and social connection. So there's a reciprocal bond that is created through acts of generosity, and that means that if you're ever in need one day, that person's more likely to be there for you and to help you out. So, a closer sense of community and trust is built between the two parties. In Proverbs it says, "One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered." Science backs that up. A person who gives will be enriched in return. A person who waters others will then himself be watered. And this is the virtuous cycle that we're talking about. Now, scientists have discovered that if you jumpstart one of these virtuous cycles, if you are generous to someone, that person will not only be generous back to you, but they'll also be more generous to the wider community. Studies at Claremont University have shown that giving is actually contagious. If you give to someone, that person will then become generous to others, and those people will then become more generous to others, and the whole thing will ripple through the whole community. It's like an atomic bomb in a way. If you drop some kindness into your community, it kind of spreads out and ripples from one person into the next. Everyone goes on this oxytocin high. They feel warm and euphoric and generous, and it all builds a closer sense of community and trust with all the people around us. You'll maybe remember this video from some years ago. The title is Kindness Boomerang, and it shows how acts of kindness and generosity can ripple throughout a whole community. So this kid is obviously fallen off his skateboard here, and a workman has seen him and come out to see if he's all right. He picks him up, he gives him his board back, and the kid now feels inspired by that kindness that he's just been shown, and so he's now on the lookout to see how he can be generous to other people. And so he's going to help this old lady across the street with her bags. Well, press fast forward, we're not going to watch the whole thing, but she's then inspired to help out another woman with coins for parking, and she's then inspired to help out someone else, and so on and so on. And basically, each person that is shown generosity is inspired to then help someone else. And eventually we'll see the kindness come right back full circle to the original workman right at the end of the video. And this isn't just some nice fanciful idea. The studies show that there is truth in this concept, and I love that idea that we can drop these kindness bombs into the world at any moment and they can still be rippling through our community days or weeks later through other people. In theory at least, there may be someone out there experiencing an act of generosity today because you set in motion a virtuous cycle maybe 2 weeks ago. You did something nice 2 weeks ago, and that inspired someone who inspired someone who inspired someone, and now there's someone 100 miles away who is being helped because of something you set in motion. There's a domino effect to this. Harvard University and the University of California did studies on this, and they said that because of this contagion, because of the way that generosity is contagious, each person in a network can influence dozens or even hundreds of people, some of whom he or she does not know and has not met. I love that idea. So there's all these amazing benefits to giving. We feel happier, we feel physically healthier, it builds our community and our relationships. It's good for everyone. And science is just discovering this. But the thing is, the Bible has been telling us to give and be generous for thousands of years. Here are some verses. Teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? And don't neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. You must each decide in your heart how much to give, and don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully. It is well with the man who deals generously and lends freely, who conducts his affairs with justice. The generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. In fact, the Bible even introduces us to the idea of the virtuous cycle. If you want to do some reading after this video, then read Luke chapter 16 verses 1 to 9. Jesus introduces us to the idea of the virtuous cycle in that parable. In fact, you can press pause now if you want to read it. And Paul also talks about the virtuous cycle when he says, "Right now you have plenty and can help those who are in need. Later, they will have plenty and can share with you when you need it." Now, the Bible rarely explicitly reveals that giving will make us happier. The Bible's focus is on giving simply because it's right, because it's good. This verse says to be generous because we trust in God. This verse says to give because God's love compels us to. This one says to give to please God. This one says to be generous because Jesus commands us to. So the Bible's focus is not really on happiness itself. The Bible's focus is on being righteous, doing the righteous thing. It just turns out that if we do the righteous thing, as the Bible commands, we will receive joy. This is the path to happiness. Actually, the Bible does kind of hint that joy comes from giving. In Proverbs it says, "The generous will themselves be blessed." And of course Jesus said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." Now, as Christians we often use that word blessed, but I think we're often quite vague on what it actually means. The original Greek word for blessed is makarios. Now, makarios is kind of a nuanced word, but it means something like amplified or lengthening happiness or bliss. So what these verses are effectively saying is, the generous will experience amplified or lengthening happiness or bliss. And what Jesus was saying is, there is more amplified or lengthening happiness or bliss in giving than there is in receiving. It's been there this whole time. It's been there for thousands and thousands of years. Okay, we're now at the end of the video, and it leaves us with a question. How are we going to change after this? To whom or what are we going to start giving generously? If we're a Christian who is not giving of our time, energy, or resources, then not only are we ignoring biblical instruction, but we are depriving ourselves of joy. To give is actually a form of self-care. It boosts happiness and physical health and relationships. In fact, there's really no point in watching these videos and thinking, that made sense, yeah, that was good, and then not doing anything about it, not changing. I want this to be a practical series that leads to real change, that leads to real joy. James wrote, "But don't just listen to God's word, you must do what it says. Otherwise you are only fooling yourselves. For if you listen to the word and don't obey, it's like glancing at your face in a mirror. You see yourself walk away and forget what you look like. But if you look carefully into the perfect law that sets you free, and if you do what it says and don't forget what you heard, then God will bless you for doing it." There's that word makarios again. If you actually do what the Bible says, God will increase, amplify, lengthen your joy, guaranteed. But there's no such promise for merely hearing about this and then taking no action. The blessing comes to those who actually do. So put this to the test. Science and the Bible agrees on this. Are you feeling anxious or depressed? Then don't go to the doctors for pills just yet. Step one on the road to recovery could just be this: to look outside of yourself and start giving generously. Now, will that step involve discomfort, discipline, and sacrifice? Yes, it will. Righteousness always does. But that's the path to happiness.